I pretended to sleep and heard my fiancé whisper into her phone, "I'll marry him for the 1M trust fund." I had always been the scapegoat of my own family, the son who was useful but never loved, while my brother was the golden child, who could do no wrong, and I thought Chloe was my escape from that cycle of being a walking ATM. But as I lay there, my breathing steady and my eyes closed in a practiced mask of exhaustion, I heard her giggly, a sharp, jagged sound that reminded me of the way my sister used to mock my poor efforts at family dinners. "Oh, stop worrying, Justin," she cooed into the phone, her voice dripping with a sugary poison that made my stomach do a slow, sickening roll. "Ethan is so desperate for approval that he'll sign anything I put in front of him. He actually thinks I'm interested in his legacy and his boring corporate goals. Once the marriage license is filed and that $1 million payout hits our joint account, I'm filing for a no-fault exit and we're heading to the coast, leaving him in the wreckage of his own pathetic loyalty." The audacity of it was staggering. She wasn't just planning to leave, she was planning a financial heist while I was still recovering from the stress of building the very empire she wanted to liquidate. Chloe continued, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated entitlement, as she described me as a fiscally irresponsible hurdle, who was lucky to even be in her presence, mirroring the exact words my own mother used before she erased me from the family photos. She told Justin, her ex who had always been the golden boy I was compared to in high school, that she had already contacted a shady attorney to ensure the prenuptial agreement I'd suggested was intercepted and replaced with a document that would grant her full access to the trust. I felt a cold, crystalline focus settle in my chest, a sense of justice porn beginning to simmer beneath my skin as I realized that Chloe had made the fatal mistake of assuming my reliability meant I was stupid. She thought she was the pretty sister of this narrative, the one who could manipulate the unwashed dog into a life of servitude, never imagining that the man she mocked while he slept was currently recording every single word on a hidden device tucked inside my nightstand. I looked at the dark corner of the room, realizing that today wasn't just the day my engagement died. It was the day the working poor scapegoat became the architect of a very permanent professional execution for the woman who tried to treat my heart like a bank account. I didn't jump up and I didn't confront her when she eventually crawled back into bed and kissed my shoulder, her touch feeling like the crawl of a parasitic insect. I simply waited for the exact moment when she felt most secure in her lie, knowing that in less than a month her dream wedding was going to become the courtroom where her reputation was lived for good. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in my life I was the one who owned the time and the keys to the kingdom she was trying to burn down. The morning sun crept across our designer bedroom with a clinical, unforgiving light that felt like a spotlight on the wreckage of my 3-year delusion. But as I watched Chloe stir beside me, her face still wearing the mask of the innocent, devoted partner, I felt a cold, surgical detachment settle over my soul that no amount of her feigned affection could pierce. I moved through our morning routine like a ghost in my own life, sipping a cup of black coffee that tasted like ash while Chloe gushed about the heavenly floral arrangements she'd picked out for the reception, arrangements I now knew were intended to be the backdrop for my public and financial execution. I headed to my office downtown, the sterile glass-walled sanctuary of Miller Private Equity, and instead of focusing on the morning's market fluctuations, I summoned my head of security and my lead litigator, Marcus, a man whose eyes were as sharp and cold as the legal filings he used to dismantle corporate predators. I played the recording for them in the soundproofed boardroom, the air in the room turning heavy and static as Chloe's voice, dripping with that unadulterated entitlement, outlined her plan to intercept our prenuptial agreement and liquidate my grandfather's legacy to fund her escape with Justin. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply opened a fresh digital file and began a forensic deep dive into Chloe's background, a search that quickly revealed she wasn't just an ambitious marketing executive from a good family, but a professional parasite who had been living the financial stability of men for a decade. We discovered that Justin wasn't just an ex. He was her partner in a series of no-fault exits that had left 3 other reliable scapegoats in a state of professional ruin across 2 different states. The audacity of her pattern made my blood run like ice, especially when I realized she had used the exact same spiritual vision speech, the one she gave me about our cosmic connection, on a software engineer in San Francisco just 18 months before we met. I realized then that I hadn't been chosen for my heart or my character. I had been selected as the high-value target for her ultimate heist because I was the reliable one who never questioned the market fluctuations in our joint household account. I spent the afternoon gaslighting the gaslighter, sending Chloe a series of excited texts about a surprise I had for the trust fund release, while mentally I was already coordinating with the bank to move the entire $1 million into an offshore holding company that would require a dual biometric signature she could never forge. I also managed to track down one of her previous marks, a man named David, who had been erased from his own company's history after Chloe's last exit. And as we spoke on an encrypted line, the sound of his dawning realization mirrored my own justice porn climax. He provided me with the contact for the shady attorney Chloe was using, a man who specialized in identity erasure and document tampering, giving me the final piece of the map I needed to ensure her dream wedding became her permanent removal from the professional world. By sunset the office was silent, the city lights reflecting off my desk like a field of diamonds I no longer intended to share, and I felt a profound crystalline peace as I realized that the unwashed dog of the family was finally the warden of his own cage. Chloe called me then, her voice a sugary poison, as she asked if I'd remembered to sign the updated insurance forms she'd left on my nightstand, very forms I knew contained a rider that would grant her an immediate payout if I suffered a stress-related medical event. I told her everything was perfectly on track, and that I couldn't wait to see her at dinner, my voice as steady as a heartbeat while I watched the digital tracker Marcus had placed on her phone show her currently meeting Justin at a motel on the edge of the city. She thought she was the golden child of this narrative, the one who was going to walk away with the keys to my kingdom, but she had forgotten that I was the one who built the empire she was trying to burn down, and I wasn't about to let a ghost walk away with my grandfather's name. The trap was set, the evidence was documented, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the one who owned the reality of our marriage. The weeks leading up to the wedding of the century were a masterclass in psychological warfare, a period where I watched Chloe spin a web of lies so intricate that even the most seasoned predator would have been impressed, yet I remained the silent architect of her professional and social living. She thought she was the golden child of our social circle, the brilliant strategist who had finally trapped the reliable scapegoat in a legal cage, never realizing that the unwashed dog she mocked was currently working with a forensic accounting team to trace every cent she'd ever stolen from her previous marks. I sat in my office at Miller Private Equity looking at the updated prenuptial agreement. Her shady lawyer had drafted a document that was essentially a financial suicide note for my grandfather's legacy, and I felt a surge of justice porn so intense it made the 80-hour work weeks feel like a vacation. I met with her attorney, a man who smelled of cheap cigars and expensive desperation, and I played the role of the fiscally irresponsible groom, perfectly nodding as he explained how the trust fund protection clauses were for my own benefit while I knew they were designed to liquidate my assets the second that IDOs were whispered. The audacity of their plan was staggering, mirroring the stories I'd heard about people who treat family like an unwashed dog or a corporate failure just to fund their own miracle life of luxury, while the ones doing the work eat rice and beans to survive. Chloe's parents, Jason and Ramona, arrived in town 3 days before the ceremony, looking at our condo with a hunger that was almost primal, immediately labeling me a poor substitute for the golden boy Justin, despite the fact that I was the one paying for their first-class flights and 5-star accommodations. At our pre-wedding dinner, Chloe leaned in and whispered that she wanted to honor our future by having a private signing of the trust fund documents that night, her eyes sparkling with that sugary poison that I now saw as a roadmap to my own professional execution if I weren't the one holding the pen. I agreed with a smile that reached my eyes but never my heart, telling her I had a spiritual vision about our financial unity, using her own manipulative language against her, while mentally I was already confirming that the $1 million was safely housed in a biometric locked vault that would only open if she could prove she wasn't a serial fraudster. As she toasted to our forever, I looked at Justin across the room, who had been invited as a close family friend, and I realized that the working poor scapegoat was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to treat an empire builder like a temporary hurdle in your own delusional heist. The dinner was a theater of unadulterated entitlement, with Chloe and her parents discussing their new coastal home and the abundance mindset they intended to adopt once my grandfather's money hit their joint account, treating me like I was already a ghost in my own life. I didn't argue and I didn't defend my boring corporate goals. I simply recorded every boastful comment and every plan for my financial erasure, knowing that the sweetest revenge wasn't just stopping them but watching them realize the ATM was officially out of service and the floor beneath their feet belonged to the person they thought they were burying. I realized then that my reliability was actually the fire that forged my spine, and as the clock ticked toward the final rehearsal, I knew that the Golden Queen was one legal signature away from realizing she was actually just a tenant on the verge of a very permanent social eviction. The air in the room felt clean for the first time in years as I watched her preen in her designer gown, oblivious to the fact that her dream wedding was about to become the courtroom where her entire secret history was presented as evidence in a multi-state fraud investigation. I checked the digital tracker one last time, seeing Justin meeting her shady lawyer at the motel to intercept the final documents, and I felt a profound crystalline peace, understanding that the best revenge is a life well lived and a vault that requires a fingerprint they can never steal. I already know some of you are shaking your head right now. Tell me why in the comments. I want to see every angle. The morning of the wedding of the century arrived with a sky so clear and blue it felt like a mocking insult to the digital graveyard I had spent the last month constructing for Chloe's reputation. But as I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't the scapegoat waiting for a blow, I was the storm itself. I watched Chloe in the vanity mirror, a vision of white silk and manufactured innocence, her jasmine perfume filling the room like a suffocating blanket of lies, while she practiced her tearful vows, never realizing that the unwashed dog she thought she was leading to the financial slaughterhouse had already moved the fence. We arrived at the cathedral, a cold marble monument to unearned status that her parents Jason and Ramona had insisted upon because they wanted the world to see their daughter marry into a miracle life of luxury, treating me like a corporate failure even as I handed the coordinator the final payment for their champagne. The pews were filled with the golden elite of Chicago, including Justin, who sat in the front row with a smug entitlement-fueled smirk, likely already calculating how he'd spend the first $100,000 of my grandfather's legacy once the no-fault exit was triggered. As the music swelled and I stood at the altar, my heart was as steady as a biometric lock. I watched Chloe glide down the aisle, her face a map of predatory greed masked by lace, and I felt a surge of justice porn so intense it nearly made me laugh out loud before the priest could even begin. When it came time for the exchange of vows, Chloe leaned in, her voice a sugary poison as she whispered about cosmic connections and eternal loyalty. But when the priest asked if there was any reason these two should not be joined, I didn't wait for a guest to speak. I reached into my tuxedo jacket and pulled out my phone, which was already synced to the cathedral's high-end internal audio system. The silence that followed was a digital vacuum as I pressed play, and the entire wedding party frozen as Chloe's own voice, sharp, jagged, and full of unadulterated urdu, boomed through the speakers, detailing her plan to marry the walking ATM for the $1 million trust fund, and then run away with Justin. The gasp that left the audience wasn't just shock. It was the sound of a total professional and social Luna living as David and two other previous marks I had invited stepped into the light from the back of the church, their presence a living testament to her decade of parasitic heists. Chloe's face went from a radiant pink to a sickly mottled purple, her golden queen facade shattering into a million pieces of broken glass as she realized that updated prenuptial agreement she had intercepted was actually a voluntary confession of interstate fraud that Marcus had tricked her shady lawyer into filing. Her parents began to shriek about family loyalty and childish grudges, but their voices were drowned out by the arrival of two federal agents I had coordinated with, men who didn't care about spiritual visions, but were very interested in the $15,000 she had illegally diverted through a Montreal shell company. I looked at Chloe, really looked at her, and saw nothing but a terrified middle-aged woman who realized her beauty couldn't negotiate with a dual biometric signature or a recorded confession, and I realized that the reliable disappointment was finally the only person in the room who could afford to breathe. I walked off the altar, my heels clicking on the marble with the sound of a final perfect period at the end of a 3-year nightmare. And as I passed Justin, I leaned in and whispered that the ATM was not just out of service, it was being used to fund his upcoming legal defense for conspiracy. The air outside the cathedral felt clean for the first time in years, the city lights no longer looking like judgmental eyes but like a field of diamonds that belonged entirely to me. And as I signaled for my security team to change the locks on the condo, I knew that the golden child era was officially dead, and the era of Ethan Miller's total liberation had only just begun. The aftermath of the wedding of the century was a tactical strike that didn't just break Chloe's heart. It unalived the very concept of her social standing in every high-end circle from Chicago to Montreal, and as the months passed, the unwashed dog they had mocked became the most formidable name in corporate forensic litigation. I didn't just walk away from the altar. I systematically dismantled the network of parasitic fraud Chloe and Justin had spent a decade perfecting, ensuring that every mark she had ever erased was given a seat at the table during her deposition. The dual biometric offshore holding company I'd established wasn't just a safety net for my grandfather's $15,000 diverted to the motel, the appraisal of David's family heirlooms, and her own texts calling me a walking ATM, to see the professional predator behind the lace. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison with zero possibility of parole for the first 10, while Justin was handed an 18-year sentence as the golden boy, who had masterminded the document tampering, finally realizing that the reliable scapegoat was the only person in the room who could afford a top-tier legal team. Her parents Jason and Ramona didn't fare much better. Once I cut off the flow of miracle funding for their 5-star hotels and first-class flights, their facade of suburban royalty collapsed overnight, leaving them in a 1-bedroom apartment over a dry cleaners in a neighborhood they used to call provincial. I heard through the grapevine that they tried to sue me for emotional battery and loss of expected inheritance, but the judge threw the case out in under 5 minutes, labeling them as complicit enablers of their daughter's criminal heists. I, however, transformed Miller Private Equity into the industry leader for asset protection and marital fraud. Detect Iona, niche I mastered while pretending to sleep in a house full of lies, and my billion-dollar portfolio now includes the very motel where Justin and Chloe planned my ruin, which I've since converted into a shelter for people recovering from financial abuse. I moved into a sun-drenched penthouse with windows that look out over the city. I now own a place where the air is always fresh, and the only scent is the expensive espresso I drink, while realizing that being the other son was actually my greatest strength because it forced me to build a spine that no socialite could ever crack. My father sent me a letter on my 35th birthday, a tear-stained envelope asking for a small loan to save his firm after my brother's latest failure, but I didn't even open it. I simply shredded it and went back to my meeting, realizing that their love was a currency I had stopped trying to earn the moment I bought their boss's desk. I am no longer Ethan the disappointment. I am Ethan Miller, the man who took his life back one legal signature at a time. And as I look out over the skyline, I finally understand that the best revenge isn't just success, it's the fact that I no longer care if they know I exist. I spend my holidays with the family I chose, people who saw my value when I had nothing but a borrowed laptop and a refusal to be broken. And as I silence my phone to enjoy the sunset, I know that the working poor scapegoat was actually the architect of the family's new harsh reality. The golden child era is dead, buried under a mountain of receipts and a reality they can't afford, and I am the only one left standing in the light. That's my read on it. I already know some of you are shaking your head right now. Tell me why in the comments. I want to see every angle.